Thanks for being here. We're going to go ahead and call the meeting to order now at 5 p.m. And we're going to go through our roll call. So Marianne.
I am here.
Franny. Oh, and Franny is no longer on the committee. Is that correct?
She has retired.
Correct.
Retired. Okay, go with that.
Yeah.
Mike.
Present.
Amy. Susan. Counselor Evans. Jerry. Leonard. Marty is
He's here.
perfectly timed. We'll come back. Pete.
Here.
Philip. Leah.
Here.
And Marty.
I am here. I was in the wrong place. Sorry.
No worries. Perfect timing.
Yeah.
I have no preliminary remarks at this point. I'm glad that the second half of this will be talking a little bit more about our intention. And moving into any announcements or additions to the agenda from anyone? Okay, we'll go ahead and just jump into our mobility management strategy discussion. Hand it over to Andrew.
Thanks, everybody. So I guess first order of business, Camille, could you bring Adrian and Belinda over? Those are our consultants from Tool Design Group. And they will be helping us today to facilitate our discussion. So they're really important, to me at least. Great.
They are on their way. Zoom is just processing.
Awesome, they're here. So thanks for that. I'm just going to give a quick introduction and then turn it over to our consultants today. So I think most of you are familiar with mobility management strategy, but for anybody watching online who hasn't heard about this project before, we at LTD have been working with our consultants at Tool Design Group to really take a look at, I would say the question we're trying to answer is how can LTD engage with kind of new modes and in new partnerships to really deliver better mobility to our community. And so that encompasses a whole range of things, but the mobility management strategy is really just about, I think, defining our role in a lot of the options that are presented to us and really helping to move the needle on transportation in our community. So I'm happy to answer any big questions about the project. We've been doing public engagement and we've been doing a lot of background research on kind of how other agencies are doing this and what LTD is already doing. And we presented, I think very briefly, a taste of that work at the last SPC meeting. So I think we're gonna give you a little bit more today as background. But we want to engage with you all in a discussion about kind of how you view LTD's role in providing transportation and how we can be strategic in thinking about new services and how we engage in new partnerships. So we're really looking for your feedback here. And with that, I will, well, before I turn it over to consultants, we have a question. Marty?
I'm going to always throw the preemptive out there. I'm always going to be asking about digital accessibility. That's my wheelhouse. I'm always in that space. It tends to be one of the last things people think about, but for our just the riders and the customers that are going to be dealing with disabilities, they also have that mindset of how do they navigate the web, navigate devices, navigate certain things that may be difficult that they have to adapt to get schedules, to get things of that nature. Is that something that the consultants have been taking into consideration as well?
I'll say sort of. That's maybe really project specific and something that we always need to be aware of. And I think particularly as we're thinking about if things are new, right, then our riders are not as used to them. We're not as used to all of the issues that might come up with people trying to use those services. So in that context, yes, it's definitely a consideration, but we're not proposing as part of this project any specific change. So our outcome won't be LTD should operate this kind of device in this area. What we're trying to do is really to set up a framework that helps us to make decisions. So we're kind of a step behind where we would actually address your concern. I mean, your concern is certainly something that's on our mind, but before we could address that, right, we have to have a specific project or proposal. So we're really trying to get at how LTD can think about whether we should be doing some of these things. And then once we decide whether or not that fits with all of our services and our, you know, what we're good at, and we have the right partners, then I think we need to address your concern on a project by project basis.
I totally get it. I just try to bring it up early, so it's something to be thinking about. So
thank you.
I totally get it. You bet.
No, I appreciate it. I hope we have lots of robust conversation today. So you're getting us started early, and I appreciate that.
You bet.
So I'll turn it over to Belinda and Adrian, who are going to, I think, give a little presentation and then facilitate a discussion.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone. I'm Belinda Udelman. I'm a planner with Tool Design, and I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Adrian Whitty, who's our Tool Design's new mobility practice lead. So we have a presentation we'd like to share with you all today, and we'll kind of intermix it with opportunities for discussion, so you don't have to listen to just Adrian and I talk the whole time. But thank you so much for having us tonight. We're really excited to be working on this project, and excited to share where we are at with you today. So I will share my screen and talk us through a few slides. So throughout the mobility management project, we have been evaluating all the different services that are present in the Lane
Sorry
County.
to interrupt, Belinda. I think we're looking at the wrong screen. I'm seeing your presenter notes.
Thanks. There we go. Is that better?
Much better. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that. So as part of this process, we've been looking at all the different mobility services that are active in the Lane County region, who provides those services. We've also been speaking with the public to learn about their interaction with those services, what some of the gaps are and opportunities to provide services in the region. And as Andrew mentioned, we're not going to be identifying specific services as part of this project, but we just want to get a solid foundation of what's on the ground right now, so we can think about how LTD should consider its role moving forward. So through this process, we've been documenting a lot to try to understand all the great services that exist and who's involved in providing those services. And so from this process, we have this massive mobility services matrix that we put together. And after reviewing the matrix of the services, the key players, and speaking with different agencies about the roles that they play in those services, along with LTD staff, we have come up with this list of about 10 different mobility management roles. So these roles represent the different roles that would be involved in providing a mobility service. And it's possible that there would be a service, you know, that where one of these roles may not apply, but in general, all or the vast majority of these roles would apply to a new or existing service. And the way that we've been thinking about these roles are in terms of sort of key roles and then support roles. So the key roles, which are those shaded in the dark gray, these are funder, manager, coordinator, and owner. So for these are kind of the champion or like really key roles in supporting a service. So they partners who would play these roles take on a sort of larger kind of authority over the service or a liability, and kind of really take ownership over the service. And then the support roles, which are all of those in the lighter blue, those typically would require kind of a much less investment on behalf of an agency or partner. So I will briefly go through how we're thinking about defining each of these roles, just so we can all be on the same page as we move forward and use these the terms for these different roles as we move through the presentation. So the funder, that's sort of an obvious one, but that can be an agency that is providing either direct funding for a service or it's more of a conduit for funding. So maybe LTD applies for a federal grant and then provides funding for the service. Manager and coordinator, that's someone who's more involved in sort of the day-to-day operations of the service. Thinking about, and that could include something like contracting a service that someone else provides, collecting or dispersing funds, and just kind of dealing with the administrative responsibilities of a service. The owner is an agency or partner who really maintains the ultimate responsibility and liability for a program or service, as well as the associated assets for that service. They're also responsible for ensuring that all of the roles are filled. So then moving into the support roles, there's a planner, which is someone who provides sort of critical support for a program or service. That could be assessing feasibility or helping with trip or route planning. And the operator is someone who's responsible for that on-the-ground service delivery. So that could be service or fleet deployment, recruiting or training or overseeing drivers, collecting fares. In the case of a bike share program, that could be rebalancing bikes. And then next is the technology provider. So this is a partner who would provide software needed to operate the program or service. So this could be something like helping with routing or trip planning or fare collection or reservations for a service. And the vehicle provider, in this case, we're talking about all kinds of vehicles, since for this project, we're looking at all aspects of mobility. So it could be buses, but it could also be vans or bikes or e-scooters. Next are the partners or advisors. And this is someone who's really providing that strategic support during sort of key milestones of a program or service. They may help with planning or evaluation or specific tasks like permitting or station siting, or participating in an advisory committee. And then the data analyst, that one is a role that's really just focused on analyzing customer or rider data. They may help with reporting analysis of customer usage data to a funder, or it could be just analyzing ridership data as part of academic research. It's not really a evaluator role, it's just analyzing data, and then that might be given to a planner or owner or coordinator for evaluation. And last is the promoter, which we mean by this is that someone who just sort of promotes the service to potential customers. So that could be through marketing, community education, or outreach. So those are the different roles associated with mobility management. And so we're going to take sort of a closer look over the next few slides about how LTD fits in with those different roles for different services. So first, I think it's probably well, some of you know or maybe don't know, LTD already has played or does play all of those roles in existing or past services. So on the slide, you can see a few different examples of services and LTD's involvement. And the asterisks by the different services indicate which role or which services LTD plays one of those key roles. So the funder, owner, or manager, or coordinator. So as you can see, it's quite a lot. There's the EMX, the MX bus, obviously traditional transit, paratransit services, the on-demand transit down in Cottage Grove, the group pass program, and LTD's electronic fare payment. So we can look at a few other services as well and see what LTD's role is and how that's evolved over time. So this service, which is Peace Health Rides, the bike share program, So in the beginning, LTD actually played, a little bit more of a strategic or key role by helping to facilitate the feasibility study for bike share in Eugene. And then as a result of that feasibility study, it was sort of recommended that LTD actually not be the key owner or manager of the program. And so the city of Eugene is currently fulfilling that key role. And LTD has more of a support role as a partner advisor in the service. And for the LTD connector, the on-demand microtransit program down in Cottage Grove, for this service, LTD is really fulfilling a key role here, but also working with other partners like South Lane Wheels and the city of Cottage Grove to manage the service. So just from these two examples and some of the other services that I highlighted in the beginning, we can think about some of the different themes that LTD might consider moving forward and as part of this decision-making framework that we'll be developing. So what is it a regional service? Is the service providing fulfilling a gap in a service? Is it providing service to a community that doesn't already have service? So there's just a bunch of different questions that we can think about to help guide LTD as it thinks through whether it has interest or capacity to be involved in a service and at what level moving forward. So to help us think through some of those questions, we actually have questions for you all. So I'm going to turn it over to Adrian to guide us through a discussion about some of the different factors we might want to think about as we're developing the strategy for LTD.
Great, thanks, Belinda. Evening, everyone. Thanks for having us tonight. Maybe we can get started just by asking a general question. Were there any sort of questions or clarifications on the roles that Belinda described, or are there any components that you're asking, hey, where does this piece fit in terms of LTD's work, that we can answer? Okay, good.
Sorry, I guess one of the things, and again, maybe it might be a little bit more clear, but thinking about the role of in our diversity and inclusion and accessibility. I mean, I think that, yeah, just kind of I feel like that's embedded into all of the parts of this,
yeah.
and also, but it's not called out directly. So just wanting to, as we go through this process, I like to kind of hear about that, or thinking about very visual. So how are we looking at priority populations and folks that, I'm just thinking about as things change for folks and having access, just how that fits into the roles, and that it should be in every single aspect of each of these roles. So just wondering more about, wanting to hear a little bit more about that.
Totally agree, Alma. And what I would say to that is kind of these roles are they're roles that somebody has to play to make a specific service work. And I think you're identifying that, diversity, equity, inclusion, probably a whole bunch of other things are some of our values, right? And that shows up in the strategic business plan and a lot of our other work. And so that's definitely going to show up in our framework, where we're like, hey, what's the need? Who are we serving here? And then that kind of leads into well, naturally we'd play these roles, right? If there's a big equity component, maybe it makes sense for LTD to fund it. But if it's not, an equity specific program, maybe it doesn't make sense. But that's actually a question I would ask, you all. I'm not sure how that fits into the conversation, Adrian, sorry if I'm hijacking it. But I think the way I'm thinking about it is that we're not defining our values as part of this. We did that with strategic business plan. And so our framework should really look to those values and say, these are the things that we said were important. How are those being incorporated in these projects? But I guess, do you view it differently? Do you think that we need more than that?
I guess
maybe the question would be, do some of our values, do we believe them strong enough that you would take different roles? Like I said, if there's an equity component, would we be willing to fund things that we wouldn't be willing to fund otherwise. Is that a true statement? Are there other roles that we would play if equity was a consideration, or other values that we have?
I guess that's kind of the question for, again, for us to be thinking about. I'm wondering and I appreciate you framing it that way, Andrew. So it's like, what is the lens that we're using to like filter the decision making about each of these aspects? So how are our values framing the decision making process? So again, I'm just throwing this out there. Like, if we are looking at if we're using one of our values and we're making a decision, how does that weight play out? So that's just kind of, I would like to just explore that with the team and kind of hear a little bit more about how that fits into the decision-making process.
I think we're at the stage where we've recognized that it's important. And I guess what I'm trying to ask is how important, like how do you all think we should be weighting those things? Or if we have competing values, maybe something's really good from an equity standpoint, but it's really bad from a greenhouse gas standpoint, and we want to do things like not looking for specifics. I guess I'm just looking for any kind of initial reaction you all have. How should we be thinking about that? Because we don't have a solution yet. That's why we're asking. Tom, we cannot hear you.
No, we still can't get you, Tom. Got it. I think one thing to answer, Alma, your question, and also one of Marty's earlier points around digital accessibility is, our public outreach process has included, has some really good and interesting findings around, what are people's like basic needs and gaps right now, and some of the things that come out of that are definitely focuses on very basic services. Belinda is probably better equipped to talk about some of these, but things like the frequency of transit, or the service time of transit, or even just being able to get to the bus stop, let alone so I think we have this lens. And I guess I'm making this point to say that you're right. Equity is this piece that needs to be sort of layered and lensed over all of the different roles and frameworks that we come up with. And one of those is just like the nature of the services that we're exploring, and what are the barriers that people face to those. Tom, try again.
I'm back.
Great, we can hear you.
Thanks. No, I was just going to pick up on some of what Andrew was talking about around values, and I think our values are a collective set, right? So we're not going to choose our favorite one and say this is what we're doing. So we want to think about how they work together, and I think that's something. Number one, we're starting to look at that internally, but it'd be really, I think that's worthy of some conversation. And maybe I don't want to get away from what we're talking about tonight, but you're just raising the issues, using our values to really define some of these, especially the emerging programs where we're not sure. You can't give you a cost benefit analysis of it, but we want to know, where is this hitting our values, and how do we move forward? So just kind of laying that out for context.
So maybe this can help us sort of get towards that. I'm interested in the group's thoughts around, when you see services that are already out there or that you've maybe seen in other places, when should LTD really be considering playing that key role, one of those key roles, which is the owner, manager, or funder? Are there obvious sort of thoughts straight away that from what you saw presented by Belinda, that you're like, well, LTD should really consider that key role in these contexts or in these situations versus a support role?
I don't want to get too far ahead of myself on this as well, because when I was working helping LTD work with document remediation and making sure their documents were accessible for people with disabilities. I was doing a lot of contact with different transit districts across the country, and actually I had come across someone in, I believe it was Philadelphia, that was working with an organization that had some digital technology for helping people that were visually impaired, for scanning different things so they could auditorily hear where they were at. So it was like a technology that they were going to be incorporating with all their different transit stuff. So there's technology out there. But again, I don't want to put that out as this may be ahead of the mindset of where you're at this point for suggestions. But I know there's stuff out there for transit, for people with disabilities.
I think those are good things for us to add to our knowledge base, right? Because we're actually going to present here in a little bit about some of the case studies that we've heard. They're not as specific as that to get down to, here are specific things that can solve specific problems. But I think it's important to keep some of those in mind, especially as we hear from community partners, like what their basic needs are.
Yeah, I guess in response to your question, and Andrew said this already, but there's been a lot of work put into the strategic business plan. So thinking about how the framework that is included in that plan informs or kind of mirrors this framework. So I think there are those, I don't remember what they're called, like 5 pillars, maybe strategic priority areas, whatever they are, around sustainability. I know I've heard customer satisfaction, a few others. So thinking about those as potentially the same kind of priorities and pillars. So like thinking about customer satisfaction, how does this new opportunity program tool, whatever technology, whatever it is, serve LTD's existing customers, either to get, that first mile, last mile, or whatever that might be, and speak to that existing priority. The other thing, though, that I was thinking with that is the values, I think, are different than those 5 pillars, right? So equity, and I might be misremembering this, but equity being a value, but not necessarily a strategic priority. So that doesn't necessarily cover the values, but just thinking in terms of like alignment with the strategic business plan and all the work that's already happened there.
Yeah, makes sense. Thoughts from others?
I'll chime in. I think kind of in line with what Leah said, I think everything has to be prioritized, right? So it comes down to what is the priority. Does LTD have the budget and the resources, whether that, staff resources and actual dollars to take on certain roles. Knowing that you have to prioritize, I think it's important to, first you focus on your core business and then look at kind of what the goals are, in what ways are we looking to make service more equitable? In what ways can we promote customer satisfaction? What areas will have the biggest impact on those bottom line goals that the agency is trying to achieve? So it's not an easy question to answer, but those things.
And it may be that, and we've been doing a lot of thinking internally with Andrew and his team about, this does, like, how descriptive is the decision-making framework versus how, flexible is it? And I think, Amy, I think you're hitting on some points there that priorities may change and budgets may change, and having some flexibility around how those decisions are made, but like overarching themes being consistent feels important. Okay, I might, unless there's other comments, we might move into the next section here, and we can come back and revisit this if we need to. Tom, before I do that,
just really quickly, I don't want to derail the momentum, but I would say at some point we should probably come back to the group and talk about the structure of the strategic business plan. The 5 that was referenced relates to the 5 outcomes that we're looking for, and or strategic areas of focus, I guess, that we identified that are really high level, structural, and over time, you might recall we gave weight to each of those, but over time the weights may shift and we may want to do things differently, and so I think there's that, to think about that as one dimension of how we might apply this tool, and maybe values is another dimension. So that, those 2 things, values and these strategic areas of focus, are really working together. It's how we're going to focus our work to meet the values and vision and mission that we have. So just clarifying that.
Great. Well, the other thing that we wanted to bring to you tonight is some work that actually, our partners VIA did, but I'm going to try and do my best to present the big picture themes from that work. And that was really to do a scan of other transit agencies around the country of varying sizes and see what they're doing in the mobility management space. So I really wanted to focus in on the key themes and learnings that have come out of that review, and get your sort of thoughts and opinions on some of those key learnings or case studies that really sort of rise to the top for you, that you're like, I really like that idea, or I really like this component of what this agency is doing. So what this work was is we actually interviewed 10 different, well, we actually interviewed 9 out of the 10 that we'd identified transit agencies around the country that are, sort of being innovative in the mobility management space. And we were looking at a lot to do with how do they organizationally, or big picture themes around how do they manage mobility services. But there are some key learnings around specific mobility services too that aren't represented here in this presentation. But I think the first thing that really is obvious out of that work, and LTD is already knows this from the mobility services that are operating in the region, is that this is very much about partnerships, and it's really interesting, and was interesting to see the range of partners that are really involved in mobility management, and identifying like who is the sort of the right person to champion an idea versus take on a supporting role. And so that can include cities and nonprofits, other transit service providers in some cases, but there's also a very big component of third-party contractors that might be able to come in and offer service at economies of scale that can really be taken advantage of as well. In terms of key themes, wanted to focus on a few. What came out of this work is that in some cases, the need for those mobility service or new mobility services was really to fill certain gaps. And we've categorized these into 2. So service area gaps, where there may not be transit service in a certain area. So for example, Cap Metro in the Austin area joined up with CARTS, which is the transit provider in the rural counties around Austin, to form an Office of Mobility Management. And the focus of that office is really to address gaps in the service area collectively, and to also make it more seamless to travel in that sort of 11 county region. Another example in that space is Move PGH, which is Pittsburgh. So they have a collective of new mobility companies that includes Spin e-scooters, the transit agency, car sharing service, trip planning apps. And they've come together to form this collective to be able to provide these mobility services all at these mobility hubs. So that's another example of this sort of collective filling service area gaps where there may not be service currently. Then there's this other group that is looking at services that fill needs that aren't currently met by the existing service, and not so much the geographic gaps, but more specialized than that. So, for example, Pinellas Suncoast Transit Authority in the Florida area started partnering with, they use TNCs to deliver paratransit trips and on-demand trips, and also to fulfill temporal service gaps, if you like. So if service only goes until, let's say, midnight, but you need to access your job or get home from your job outside of those hours, then this is a way to be able to do that. We also learnt a lot about how ideas are driven and how they float through the decision-making process. And they can really be going in two directions. One is this sort of leadership-driven ideas, and the other one is more staff-driven ideas. And on the leadership side, what was really apparent is that agencies that have had success in these mobility management have really had very strong board and leadership support to be able to implement those ideas. It sounds obvious, but that's a key takeaway. A couple of examples here on screen. One that was really eye-opening was Denton County was really about strong leadership that also trickles down to shifting culture of an organization. So in a lot of cases, transit agencies are known even internally see themselves as providing just transit service, and changing that sort of culture to be more comprehensive of enhancing that mobility service more broadly. And in Denton County, that was an example of where they actually had to do some proactive steps to move the whole culture of the organization towards that. Cap Metro, again, in the Austin area, is another good example of how leadership might inspire an idea. So in this case, it was a VP doing a sponsored trip to the Netherlands and seeing examples of services that they thought could fill gaps in their local region. And then other ideas are completely driven from the ground up. And some examples of that on the right of the screen here. One that I really like is just up the road. It's in the city of Portland. They have a transportation wallet program that brings together collective mobility services under sort of one payment structure or one payment card. And that program really began as just a sort of a staff discussion around the water cooler as an idea, and then was able to sort of be driven from there and move up the organization. The other important theme or lesson here, and I think this was talked about in our discussion there, was the impact to the agency and how you manage that. So in some cases, or in most cases, a lot of these services are new, and especially new to a transit organization. And so what tends to happen is the department that sort of seeds the idea tends to keep that responsibility, and oftentimes has to sort of figure out how to make it work and manage that. So we actually have the opportunity to be to get proactive and be able to learn from the experience here, rather than some of these agencies like the UTA, which had these microtransit ideas, but that their microtransit is just living in this one department and not really moving into their transit operations groups. So we have some opportunities there to be able to learn how the organization could adapt to accommodate some of these new mobility services. And then on the other side is also the impact to agencies could be streamlining of services. So there's a couple of good examples here. The one, Get is a good example of where different mobility services had different ownerships and managements, and that all coming into one collective office or department has allowed a lot of streamlining and efficiency in terms of staffing and you know, costs and all those sorts of things. And other examples here could be, you know, other efficiencies around, you know, for example, the San Joaquin RTD program is a good example of where a lot of services, especially to low income folks, have certain eligibility requirements, and their group actually allows for this sort of collective coordination of those eligibility checks and qualification processes. So in that case, instead of having all of the different cities and agencies in the region doing their own, there's this collective efficiency around doing that in one process. I'm just going to go through these sort of learnings to try and bring some of this into focus. So the key learnings here, there's, I think, let's see, there's 9 of them in total. One of the key ones is agreeing on that clear mission. So making sure that that mission is identified and that it floats throughout the whole organization. So if there is a focus on mobility and components of mobility, that's like supported throughout. Board and executive support was key and was often the driving force behind initiatives. Alignment with regional stakeholders is important. And I think particularly so here is this, yeah, both the alignment with regional stakeholders and the consulting with regional stakeholders. Yeah, I think there's a pretty good relationship in Lane County with the different partners and agencies, and I think there's a real opportunity there to be looking at, okay, who is the right fit for these different roles and being able to coordinate those. Encouraging innovation was a key learning. You know, how do you create opportunities for ideas to percolate and to flourish, and whether that comes from sort of leadership down or staff up. One of the key movements, it seems, in transit agencies that are supporting mobility management is to create specific departments, like an office of mobility management, where those ideas can at least seed and then maybe live as they're sort of being tested, and then as they're sort of growing and before they transition into the larger organization. Ongoing responsibility for new programs was where sometimes there's this there's like a gap for where programs should live, and being able to make sure that those responsibilities are clearly defined about, like, where can those ideas get their support within an agency or within partnerships. Risk and ambiguity was something that was particularly important. A lot of these transit agencies trying new mobility services often do so. They want to fill a gap in a quick, short amount of time and show progress. And being able to sort of be nimble and be able to accommodate that and sort of adapt on the fly was a theme that we heard over and over, and not being so, not having to, you know, sort of go through a big timely process before that service actually emerges on the street. And then contracting service versus direct operation, like making decisions around when contracting could with a third party could be more efficient and reduce some of the, you know, overhead costs of, for example, operating a bike share program or a e-scooter pilot or something like that. So those are kind of the key learnings from the case studies, and I'll pause there and maybe firstly just ask any sort of general questions from that work. Okay, so I know we went through that fairly quickly, but were there any of those case studies or any ideas that popped out of those that you thought that you think we should definitely explore further, or that you were really excited about out of that work?
I'll jump in. I just appreciated kind of seeing the examples and everything. And I guess kind of coming back to the question that was brought up earlier about when LTD should play, the role, a key role versus a support role. And knowing that LTD is kind of doing this already, we are kind of maybe it's not a formal structure as what we're talking about right now, but I guess I would kind of look at like where LTD has the experience and capacity and experience and capacity, and the role of a key role makes more sense than a supporting role. And it seems like that's kind of in everything we're looking at. It feels like that's coming out, like that's what we're helping to define. And I recognize that like that might take time to step back and do that. And I'm also, I think we did talk about this before, but just a little bit of in the role that LTD's in right now, kind of already doing this a little bit. Like we don't have a centralized department that's like managing all of that. Just wondering how, like, what are some of the challenges that are in the space right now? Like, I guess to me, it's like, if we can define what some of the challenges are, here's some of that might also kind of be able to help with some of the other pieces based on, as Leah and Amy were sharing, the strategic plan and how does this align there? Are there pieces that we have already in place to kind of help make, that's kind of like a decision-making tool for going back to our strategic plan. So again, those are just some of the things that I appreciate all of those examples. And then it's also helping me like, well, there's a clear space for LTD to play that role and a clear space to step back and have someone else lead that work. And we'd be the supporting role in that.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful, Alma. And some of the work that we're just starting to really get into now is actually working with the directors groups to understand, what's the potential impact on your department or your role at LTD, and starting to understand where those capacity pinch points are or where there's alignment with what they're doing already. So we're starting to dive into that work, and it's seeming like the frame in our early discussions, you're sort of looking for three things. There's interest, capacity, and funding. And, how does, what's the sort of alignment with those three things, and where does that fit?
Can I add to that a little bit? I know, because that was a good question, Alma. A couple of things that I think about. One is LTD is a small enough organization that we may not set up a new department to do this. And in fact, it's probably more likely that we'll have a group that works on this internally that's across the organization. And of course that's really the nature of the director's conversation right now is, what does this look like? The other really important piece of this is that I feel like we're here today, not just because, Andrew's framed a really good question for us internally, and we're kind of acting on that to see kind of what this means. But also when you look at our history, we have a history of doing, thinking outside of the traditional fixed route transit box. Even the being the first fully lift equipped vehicles, was thinking about the whole trip, not just once people get on the bus, where do they go? How do they get on the bus? How do they get to the bus? Those types of things. And then the innovations around, thinking about MX. Those are things that we've done. I mean, some of these ideas started in planning. Other things started. The lift equipped buses was really a passion that Phyllis Luby, one of our general managers, had very early on. And so I think as we've grown up and where we're at today, we have, I think, a broader perspective. And I'm throwing that out there because that's one of the exciting things about this whole process is that we have, in creating this strategy, we're trying to set up that process that's not only kind of internal staff driven, but this becomes then an element of how SPC looks at what we're doing and what the needs of the community are, and you help materially help us figure out what role we should play in those things. So I'm just kind of putting out some additional framing for that.
Are there others that, either from the case study list, any sort of ideas that came forth out of that, or maybe, in your own work? I know you're all sort of connected, professionally or personally interested in this space. Are there other places you've seen or ideas that come to mind that we should be thinking about and looking at?
If I can ask the question maybe kind of a different way too, and tie it back to our roles, right? Like, we have a long history of doing this, and I think you all are familiar with a lot of LTD's programs, and without, necessarily trying to think through like, well, LTD played this specific role and that specific role. I'm wondering if you all can give us feedback that we can kind of put into that partnership role. Like, have you ever looked at something LTD was operating and been like, why are they driving that vehicle? Why isn't LCOG driver? Why isn't someone else driving that vehicle? Or, I don't understand why LTD chose to fund something that somebody else seems to be working on, right? Like, one way I've been thinking about a lot of these roles, it just helps me, is to really think about the services we're already offering. Because as I think Belinda mentioned, we're playing all 10 roles today. And I would bet you money we're better at some of them than others. So what do you think about it in terms of that, Mike?
My comment was not related to your question, so let's address that first.
You can comment anyway. Maybe it'll take us in a better direction.
Well, it may not be directly related to what we're talking about, but it occurs to me that that the STIF process that is relatively new might fit into the funding aspect of this, and that should be noted, because it's sort of a regional effort and it's statewide, and I just want to put that on the table for consideration.
Noted.
I'll just say, I think the thing that is sticking with me is looking at projects and partnerships that either get more people onto LTD services, or ensure that LTD services are, more equitable and more accessible, right? So to me, those feel like the ground floor of what these additional partnerships and projects do or should potentially do, and kind of grounding it back into kind of, and maybe that's or maybe that's not as innovative as folks want to get through this process, but really like that grounding in connecting this community, thinking about how people are connected. The bus network and MX are really the backbone of that, in terms of non-personal vehicle travel. So thinking about how we get more people onto the bus, or more people helping first and last mile, I think I already said, but that to me just is still where my head is sticking in terms of where these additional partnerships and programs do the most good.
Thanks for that feedback, Leah. I'll just say one thing that I don't say enough when we're talking about this project, right, is that we're talking about lots of new things, and we haven't talked about 40-foot buses yet. But I think, right, like we're trying to figure out how to engage with all of those other things, but we know that 40 and 60-foot buses are the best tool a lot of the time. So when we're asking ourselves, like, hey, what tool should we be using? We are talking a lot about new and innovative things. Whether those are new and innovative is, I think, debatable in a lot of circumstances, but they're new to us. And so we're trying to get a better grasp on those. But you're right that 40 and 60-foot buses are often the only tool that we can use to achieve a lot of our goals. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Alma?
I think Mike, do you
Oh,
want to go?
Yeah, I put my hand up again. I just wanted to ditto that comment. First, what I hear a lot from people is, once I get to the bus, it works great, but getting there is a hassle for me, or it's really a problem. I just don't have a way to get to that 40-foot bus or to the MX. So that first and last mile thing that you're talking about, Lee, I think is pretty important.
Mm-hmm.
I think this kind of springboards off of Leah and Mike. Kind of, we talked about new and innovative, and maybe using we built this, we have the strategic plan, and we have this, we're looking at talking about our equity lens, and how are we, we can kind of take how are we looking to evaluate, what we are doing, using that lens. Not that we didn't go into any of the work we did without it, but now we're really, there's a commitment, right? So maybe that's where part of this conversation happens too. Are we evaluating for accessibility and that first and last mile, so I'm just bringing that up too. There's the new and innovative, and then there's also how are we reflecting and then kind of evaluating and kind of helping make some of those determinations as well. Because then maybe that'll also help with that, the key role versus support role. Are there others doing this? Again, we're a small enough community, and also that could help us kind of think about moving stuff around and determining if there are others that are doing things a little bit differently, that we could shuffle things a bit and do some more investments in the community, some other non-traditional partnerships that are a little more accessible for folks in the community.
So, go ahead, Marianne.
Sorry, gotten used to Teams and now I don't know how to use Zoom. Just one thing I've been thinking of through all of this is making transit be kind of somebody's first choice, rather than oh, I can't drive and it's I don't have anywhere else to, or any other method. Making transit or micromobility or whatever it is be easy and straightforward to get where you need to go. And I'm just, one thing we talk about all the time is, can an 8-year-old use it and can an 80-year-old use it? And just thinking about those sorts of things, that if it's really truly accessible for everybody, having it be, or focusing on, is this easier and more fun than using a car? And I think that would be kind of a lens to take as well.
Great. Marty?
And I'm actually going to echo what Marianne is saying, because I think back comparatively growing up in Denver and being a persistent bus driver. I kind of grew up on the bus to school, from school, to work, from work. I mean, there wasn't any crevice in Denver and Denver County proper that I couldn't get to on a bus. So literally, I loved taking it because traffic sucked. So I think in a mindset of just what she said, thinking about that as a comparative nature here, and incorporating what Mike was talking about earlier, as far as that first and last mile mindset. Even in my neighborhood, I think about it sometimes. My daughter just actually came out here. She's going to be starting at Willamette High here, and she's got to figure out the bus thing, and she's got a job that she's going to be working over off of Delta Highway, and I said, yeah, the bus is going to be great. And I'm trying to think, I don't even know what routes to tell her to take. So echoing what Marianne was saying, making sure that it's going to be just that simple comparatively. Because I mean, if I was in Denver, which obviously is a much bigger city, 2 routes, I would be able to tell her where to go, how to get to where she needed to get to, because it was just that second nature. So getting people to fall in love with it, and that mindset. And maybe, again, I guess goes back to a comment I made once before about how things are marketed, how we're, as not just necessarily strategic planning, but also just as an organization as a whole, what kind of message is going back out to the community? I guess a proof of performance. We're here. We're trying to make sure you know that we're here, and it's a fun thing, you know. And people are saying it is, not just us. So that's my 2 cents.
Great. Andrew or Tom, anything that we didn't hit on today that you wanted to ask the group?
Well, I'll just say I think this is, as you can tell, an emerging conversation that we're having. I think it's timely, but what I'm listening to here, you all are, I think, understanding why this, how we're looking at this is important, and as we move toward a final product, it's something that we hope to be able to be used, as the name implies, in informing our strategies around these emerging issues, and it really becomes a tool for guiding us through change. And I think actually, we want to talk a little bit about that in the next item we have on the agenda around your role. And so I'm interested in exploring more with this group in particular, as this strategy becomes more final, how we can actively together actively work to implement and develop a sense of what the appropriate roles are for us, and how we can in turn then accomplish. I think, Marty, in terms of what you're saying, it's not just the fixed route that we want people to have as kind of like the back of their hand, but this whole system. You might have to take a couple of steps, but eventually you get where you need to go. So good discussion today.
I guess one of the questions I would have too is just, so LTD is kind of already doing this in a lot of ways. Like, what are the tools now that you use to make those decisions about, again, what role you'll play? And will some of those carry forward in this next process? I mean, and again, maybe it's just by happenstance that things happen, like on not in silos, but like on a case-by-case basis, which is the nature of the world. And now we're trying to streamline it. But I guess for this team, if we're thinking about strategic direction and strategic decision-making, what are some of the, how have you made those decisions about what role LTD plays in those processes in the past, and what has worked, and maybe what, again, maybe that's a huge question I'm asking, but in a nutshell, what has worked, and maybe what do you want to keep doing? And that might help this team who's trying to look more strategically at decision making. At least for me, that would be helpful to kind of get an idea.
No, that's a good question. And
go ahead, Andrew.
Tom's got more history than me, so I'll give what I know, and then Tom can probably go back a few more years. So, I mean, I'll say, if you look at some of our programs, I think about things like the Diamond Express going to Oak Ridge, right? Like, we manage the contracts on that. We do a lot of support work, but it's funded through some grants from ODOT to Oak Ridge, and they're out of district, right? So, I mean, we provide a lot of help to them, and I don't know if, like, you could calculate a cost, but we provide help to them, and that's super great because it connects to our metro region. I think about so that got started, I believe, because ODOT was looking for someone many years ago who could operate transit between Oak Ridge and Eugene, and we seemed like a really logical choice. Other things like, I think, our Cottage Grove connector, which is the on-demand service in Cottage Grove that we started a couple of years ago. That was really an internally driven idea. Mark had seen some agencies experimenting with some of the software and the service models, and he said, hey, like, we should really try this and find out how this works in our region. And we've done that with the Cottage Grove connector and with MGO. Both of those are actually structured and paid for really differently, so they might look similar and they use the same software, but you get down into it and we play different roles in them. So I think sometimes those decisions were people asking us, and I think sometimes it was nobody else can do whatever, nobody else has the ability to provide a vehicle. We provide vehicles to Willamette Lane so that they can drive. So we're involved in probably 100 different small little things, and the Ride Source call center bundles together, I think, 18 or 19 programs. So we've been doing this and feeling our way through, and we've been really successful at a lot of these programs, like way more successful than we probably realized we were going to be when we started doing them. And that's because we had, I think, talented staff and maybe got lucky too. Bit of both. But I think also one thing that I think about a lot is that LTD is changing, right? Our cost to operate is a lot higher now than it used to be. I think our cost to operate grows faster than a lot of other businesses' costs. And there are a lot of things in that we can't control. So I also think when we're thinking about this, we're not just thinking about what we did in the past, and there is a lot of really good history there, but we're also thinking about kind of where we're going. And so maybe in the past we were great at driving a route, but now whenever someone calls us up and says, hey, can you provide service to this specialized place? My first response is, well, who can help us? Because we realized a while ago that we can't do everything by ourselves. And so I think that's why we really felt the need to try and hone in on this, like, well, what role should we be playing? And there are a lot of roles, and it depends on what it is. I think you hit it really well, that there are probably reasons why we'd play every role. It depends on what it is. If it really lines up with our values, we're probably willing to do more than something that is less in line with our values. Mike, did you want to comment? You probably have a lot of good LTD history.
The things that you're saying, Andrew, is why I mentioned STIF in particular, because it connects us to LCOG and it provides a funding source that has helped us play a key role in connecting regionally and connecting parts. I mean, even though it's not LTD, we're the, I forget what you call it, the designated agency. What's that called?
The qualified entity.
Yeah. And so what you're talking about in terms of who can we work with, that process and working with LCOG has really put us in some ways in the center of making some of these connections where we're not totally the agency that's responsible, but we do play a key role in it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the needle's moving farther on that too, with bike share funding and things that LTD has no experience doing. We're helping our partners fund their programs with that.
Well, I'll just add that I think it's a combination of things to answer the question that's on the table. You can look at a number of things that we've done that are, I'll say, different from what we see our other transit districts like us are doing, and a lot of it's recognizing an opportunity, but also there's an attitude of we're curious. So I don't know, you may have heard this story before, but actually before there was a commercially available bike carrier on the front of buses, one of our fleet guys had the idea of how this might work and actually mocked up something. We never implemented that particular one, but it gave us the momentum to say, oh, hey, they're making these, let's get these on our buses. And I mentioned before Phyllis Luby saying, hey, let's make all our buses lift equipped. That comes from our values, and her, she instituted a lot of strong values in the organization early on. I'm reminded of the movie, if you're familiar with the movie Robots, there's a character in there named Big Weld, and he had the quote, see a need, fill a need. And that's what, as we are in the community, we've seen these needs. Andrew mentioned the Diamond Express service that actually came out of some federal legislation that provided some funding for connecting places where the economy has gone down, the jobs a lot of high unemployment, how we could connect those people into training and jobs. And that's the beginning of that. And we saw that as an opportunity. I was actually at LCOG at the time, and we helped assemble some of the analysis that allowed LTD to create that service. So there's just this kind of, as we're in the community, as we're in what we do, we've seen this. And I think what that's those things we haven't connected those things across the organization. So, one part of the organization saw a great idea for how to do, bikes on buses. Another one saw a funding opportunity that we could do. Community members came to us and we did X, Y, and Z. So, those things have been happening over time. And I think it's built on things to the point where we have I would say, describe internally, we have a really a can-do attitude. Andrew mentioned Mark and the work that we've done in Cottage Grove. I know Mark saw an opportunity. We actually had an opportunity to get some of the key technology that goes into mobility on demand to test it for free. And we submitted an application. We got that, and that's how that Cottage Grove service started. So there's all these different things. I could go on. Amex didn't come out of anywhere. We actually had my predecessor was involved in a process that we were doing regionally in the 90s, and he said, "Hey, I think I've seen this thing down in Brazil. Let's think about this." What this strategy is intended to do is help us kind of structure that, and I think really importantly, is engage SPC, the community represented in SPC, but as well as our kind of municipal partners. Someday we want to get bike share in Springfield. From our standpoint, that represents a really good way to feed our system and accomplish what I've heard tonight from some of you in terms of getting more people able to access the bus. So anyway, this is an exciting project, and I think it really, as I said, there's a need we have for this, and this is going to fill that need. I think allow us to take a next step.
Great. Well, thank you all again for your time and having us on your agenda tonight. And I'll turn it back to Alma and wish you luck with the rest of your agenda.
Thank you, Belinda and Adrian. Appreciate that. And we are going to be moving on now to have the second part of conversation, the Strategic Planning Committee's purpose and schedule. So we are going to, we are ahead of time. I'm very excited about that. I'm going to make my best to since we are about 9 minutes ahead, we're making good time. So I'm gonna try to keep to that. So Tom, I'll pass it over to you to talk about the purpose schedule.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing in that is you want to try and end 9 minutes early. But we'll see what kind of conversation we have. So I want to start as I I like to do, talking a little bit about some context. I had the opportunity to look at some of the very first meeting minutes of the board of directors. And if you're not familiar, the board, or the LTD, was established in June of 1970. And the first meeting was actually held in that month, and Governor Tom McCall was there because he had actually helped create the underlying state process to form districts, and the mayor of Eugene and the city manager were there, and the newly appointed by the governor board of directors. And one of the things that shows up in those early minutes of the board back then was that the citizen committee was something that was being used in a couple of other regional projects, and the directors actually formed, and I'm not sure exactly what month, but it was in 1970, first few months of their meeting, they formed a citizen advisory committee. And in those days, they used the term lay advisory committee. But the committee took on a lot of things that, I mean, it was a new day. We private sector had operated transit. There wasn't a public, or there wasn't a citizen advisory committee for that. So this was an opportunity for folks from around the community to really engage in helping make the system work. And 27 years later, I'll just drag you through a little more history. Through the board, through Rob Bennett's leadership, actually formed the Brt Steering Committee. And that's relevant because that's the predecessor to this committee. And Rob did that because he understood that this thing, bus rapid transit, was not something that anyone understood. And he knew that if it was going to be successful, he was going to have to engage, through the board, we're going to have to engage these leaders in the community to understand the details of this emerging concept and really try and make it their own. And so they talked about, the color of the bus. They talked about what the vehicles would look like, what the routes would be. They engaged that committee in doing that. And of course, in 2016, and kind of cutting to the chase here, the board actually reestablished the Brt Steering Committee as the Strategic Planning Committee. And so what I wanted to do today is really just go through and because the board in its resolution lays out a couple of key purposes, and those feed into the bylaws. So I want to quickly review those, but then I want to talk about how to move forward in terms of given the purpose of the committee and given the really some of the things that are we know are on the horizon. There's an issue, and I think you raised it, the committee raised it last time, in terms of, is the frequency, is the quarterly frequency adequate to what the purpose of the committee is, and making sure you're providing timely and strategic advice. And that's going to be built on, I think, a work program that I think we want to, I'm not prepared to do that tonight, but want to come back to you with a number of things that, and I mean, you all know, things like this project you heard about tonight is one of the projects that ultimately we're going to take to the board. We'll want your advice. That's why we spent the time tonight in this discussion. We have we're procuring soon for the next comprehensive operations analysis. Want to get your engagement at key points up front, but ultimately providing advice to the board on that. So there are a number of things we'll be updating the strategic business plan in a couple of years. Those are the types of things that you all are going to be engaged in. But what I want to talk about tonight, I'm going to take you through the resolution, just a couple of key points there. It should only take a few minutes to go through the resolution, and then the bylaws. Just to me, that creates the framework, but it's not the substance. And so that's what I want to talk about. Given that framework, what are the types of things? What roles can you play? Should you play? Let's articulate those. And next time we're going to bring back that work plan that can talk about the different role, the specific things you can engage in to apply those roles. So let me. I'm going to share my screen. We'll start with the resolution. And you can see, therefore, be it resolved. Again, like I said, this was a resolution that reestablished an existing committee to become the Strategic Planning Committee. And specifically, the board wanted this committee to provide advice focused on strategic issues. And I will say that's left somewhat undefined. So I think we have maybe a need and an opportunity to define what that entails. And that was in order to distinguish this committee from some of the other advisory committees that the board has. They have a budget committee, they have accessible services, human resources committee, several other committees. And so, this committee was charged with, focusing on strategic issues. And so I think that's part of what we want to talk about. And again, looking for independent advice. So it's not just staff coming to you saying, we think you should do this. Now, we might do that from time to time, but we want you to engage in this independently. We're not looking at the staff level. We're not looking for you to just rubber stamp what we're doing and push it forward. This is really an opportunity to really engage. From my standpoint, speaking as someone who might bring you something, not to rubber stamp, but to help move forward, I really value, and we want to see this committee really engage and reflect the diversity you have among you in terms of perspectives and however else you want to look at yourselves. But your input becomes critical if we're really going to make a difference in the community moving forward. So that was, those are things I took away from the resolution. There's some key, mechanics things, authorizes SPC to select its own chair, those things that you need to have. But that was what the resolution had. And now I'm going to just jump to the bylaws, and really all I'm going to focus on here is what basically how we took the resolution the board passed to create some framework for the committee. And again, I noticed, or I noted in the resolution, the board was looking for this committee to provide independent advice on strategic planning issues. One of the things was, and we were a little more specific here in terms of things that we're working on at the time, which was the long-range transit plan, which right now is, I would say, kind of further away from, there's a number of things that are in front of that, but we do want to update that long-range transit plan, develop the frequent transit network, making better connections, reducing trip and waiting times. Those things are all just attributes of what we're trying to accomplish, but the purpose of this committee was to really engage in those things. And so I think what I want to talk about is, well, how do we do that? And again, we can bring you a list of things that we know we're going to want you to provide advice on, but this is an opportunity tonight to really get some feedback from you all on, given this framework that the board's provided, what roles should you play? We started tonight's discussion, spent a little bit of time talking about the values that we have adopted in the strategic business plan. How do those values inform the role that you should play in this context? So those are the things I'm looking for. I'm hoping you can engage in and help us out in that regard.
Mike?
Yeah. One of the things that I think about, Tom, is the sort of the evolution of the committee. We've gone through times where the committee has spent most of its time in our meetings hearing updates from the staff. And then we've gone through other times where we've spent most of our time as a committee actually developing advice by talking with each other and considering what, sharing with each other what we're hearing from our neighbors and other people in the community. And it seems to me that this idea of independent advice is quite important. I was here when we created the committee, and I very much recall that being an important part of what we were suggesting at the time. And so one of the things that a sort of a way we can measure how well we're doing in terms of providing advice is how much of our time, of our meeting time, are we spending listening to downloads from the staff versus providing advice. And I don't mean to be sarcastic or critical about that, because it's important that we have a certain amount of information that does require us to hear downloads from the staff. But otherwise, we don't have much of a basis to operate from. But I think that we've, in recent year or maybe a little longer, have gotten away from spending, more of our time has been spent listening to the staff than it has been providing advice. Maybe I'll just leave it at that.
So, and just a quick follow-up, Mike, because I appreciate that. We hear that. We talk, Andrew and I were talking about that earlier today, and it's like there is, as you say, some need to provide you with kind of a structured presentation of the details of a project we might be working on. But what are better ways? I mean, we're thinking about, and that was a question we had, what might be some better ways to provide that to you? And I'll just throw out one of the things that we've been looking at is, as you know, with the Zoom platform, you can actually record a presentation and send it out. Would that be a good way to kind of front load, maybe before you come to the meeting, listen to the recording? We don't have to go through the presentation, but maybe we have a set of focused questions that we want to ask the group to give us feedback on. I mean, I think those are, so I'm agreeing with you that there is some call it download that probably should happen, needs to happen from our standpoint. But I think there's some better ways to do that, maybe make more efficient use of the committee's time. So I'll just maybe set that out there, and I'm going to go in the order that I see. And Leah, you're at the top of my screen there.
Thanks, Tom. Do you mind actually not sharing your screen?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Look at each other. It's a little easier for these types of things.
I just need to figure out how to do that. Here we go. There you go.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
And I'll say, Alma and Marty, I know you're relatively new to this group, and we've been having this same conversation since I joined in 2019. And I think pre-COVID, Amy and I tried really hard to Mike's point, focus in on those more like discussion-based meetings where we're really focused in on a topic for the majority of the meeting. Obviously, that's easier to do in person to an extent. So there's that. But for me, and I would echo a lot of what Mike said, that we sometimes have a lot of presentations. And I think part of that, and Tom, your point around the need to download and get that information to us is a valid one. But I think for me, actually, the core of the problem is that we're asked to advise on too many topics. So we have so many topics to be updated on and downloaded for, that we lose out on the time to actually like discuss and get into the weeds about, or not into the weeds because we're strategic, but actually get into good discussion about those topics. So I think
into the strategic weeds.
Yeah, the strategic weeds, exactly. So I think like this past year and a half, where we were really focused on the strategic business plan, we had like a topic that we were really wrapping our hands around, and could really like understand it and see where it was going and kind of follow it through the process. So for me, rather than having 8 things that we're advising staff on every year, I think it should only be like 2 or 3 that are really the top strategic priorities for that year. And, you know, there's the COA, the strategic business plan, long range transit plan when that comes, moving ahead, right? There's these couple like top bill projects that have been the big focus for this year and the last couple of years that really should, in my mind, should be our main priorities, and just cutting out the rest. I think there's a tendency that I've observed that like this body becomes a bit of a checkbox for other projects to say, okay, we talked to our strategic citizen involvement committee, which I know that needs to be done. I just don't know if this should be the group for all of those conversations. And I think drawing back on how many topics we focus on will help us to get into depth into those topics that the board has deemed priorities to get our input on. 2 other quick points and then I'll hand it over, but that would be the other thing is the last few years we've really said to the board, like, what do you want out of this group? What do you see our purpose as? And I don't know if we ever got a good answer from them. And so maybe having that board input to say, these are the 2 or 3 topics that we really want SPC to focus on this year, would help them to kind of clarify our role and value. And then the last point I'll just make is that in the bylaws, it calls out those specific organizations that should have a seat on this body. And I don't think any of those organizations are represented today, except for the board and Pete. So that's a constant issue. I know they're all very busy people, but like, if that is who is really meant to be here, and what this body was created around, then I think we're missing something in terms of the value that they see in this group as well. And if this is supposed to be truly like citizen community involvement and non-elected officials, I think that's great, but that's not what's in the bylaws, right? So
right,
just another thing I noticed.
Yeah, so just a couple of quick thoughts. First of all, I think that's really good feedback. We do tend to think about, well, what's the board deciding? Well, we better get this before SPC. And I would say, you know, let the board member speak for himself on this. But, you know, I think sometimes the board doesn't always have that. You have a very clear articulation of what this committee is, and I really appreciate that. So I totally agree on trying to focus on a couple of things. I will ask a question in that regard, and we've mentioned it before, but there is a framework for planning that we want to try and establish. We haven't been through the whole process, but the notion of the strategic business plan is updated every 3 years. The COA is intended to really inform how we're thinking about service for the next few years. That's a strategic level of engagement. So we're not talking to you about how the 61 is going to run on, you know, Coburg Road now, and so we're envisioning this process, and then the long range transit plan, which we haven't updated since it was originally adopted in 2014. There's a lot of stale language in that plan. The strategies and the vision I think are good, but you know, how does that tie into what the most strategic work we've done so far is in the strategic business plan. So, you know, how do we bring those together? And what I would, in that context, I would say there's a strategic planning process that we're engaged in: the strategic business plan, the COA, the long range transit plan. You know, those are things that might form the foundation of your engagement in this process. And yeah, there's going to be some other things that we do. Moving ahead is an example of actually an implementation of the long range transit plan. And, so that's something we really want you engaged in. We'll need your vision and views as we move forward on that. So I'm just reflecting quickly on what you said. And I definitely think we can come back with that more focused bundle. And we can go to the board and have the board kind of provide that oversight. Thanks very much for that. And Amy, I think, was next.
Oh, let me lower my hand here. So yeah, as Leah mentioned, I've also been on the committee for at least, I want to say about 4 years now, going up 4 years. It's been a while. And Leah and I were chair and co-chair at one point. And I'm going to say something a little bit controversial, so don't throw tomatoes at me, but I think we have to ask the question is, does this committee need to exist? Or at least in the form that it's in. I agree with everything that Leah said, in the sense that I think, the framework that's laid out in the charter for the committee is way too broad. So it really makes it difficult to focus and have a clear charge. And I think, you don't want to get to the point where you have an agency where you're overwhelmed with managing like way too many committees. That can be bad. But having a committee that's really focused on, this is a specific project that the agency is working on, like a planning project or other project like MX, it's great. Like there's a clear direction, there's clear outcomes that you're trying to achieve, or it might be outcomes that are tied to the strategic business plan. But I think that can be really helpful in just making sure that the group has a clear purpose. There's something to be working toward. We can have more direct conversation about those issues to, give advice to the board. The way the committee is framed now, I think it does, it's not very clear, and it creates some overlap with the board's role as well, because the board is really a strategic body too. So that's my thought, is thinking through that.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's good feedback. I do think that well, is the committee having an existential crisis? And so I appreciate that. And my hope is that we can focus things a little bit better. I think too, and I'm interested in where Pete might be on this as well, but how can the board, I'm speaking from staff standpoint, how can we support the board maybe better in helping them think through this, this role that they want SPC to play. You're right, in some respects. I mean, resolutions are most of the time purposefully broad. So, the notion of independent advice is, and strategic advice, those are terms that don't give us a lot of framing. So all that to say, I appreciate that. And again, I do feel that the committee should exist. It's interesting that the issue of we're missing our elected members. I'd like to talk a little more about that. I'd like to hear the other members on that. I do think it's because you may or may not be aware, this is a unique committee with respect to having representatives from elected representatives from Eugene, Springfield, and Lane County. There isn't another advisory committee to a policy making body that has that makeup. And it really comes out of the original role that Rob Bennett had in mind in convening the MX steering committee. He knew those elected bodies were going to make decisions eventually on something that was really important in his mind, and he wanted them to be right there on the ground floor to hear, you know, all about it, provide whatever input. But maybe we've grown past that. Maybe that's not as critical, and that's something, again, I'd like to hear how the rest of you feel about this, but I do think that's something that the board could discuss further. And I'm sorry, I don't know if Pete or Mary Ann had your hands raised, but
it was Pete. Go ahead.
I'm gonna make sure to unmute myself. I think this is a great discussion, and what Leah and Amy said, because they were here before I got on it, and I started. For those of you who don't know, before I became a board member, I was on this committee for about a year, and so my purpose here has shifted quite a bit, because my job is now to listen to you guys, and I also I think it's reasonable for us as a board, and I only represent 1/7 of it. Unfortunately, Susan, who also is our board representative here, is not here, and I wish she could weigh on it and on this as well. But that being said, I would like to. It would be good to hear a discussion of what other board members think of what this committee is supposed to be, and I don't know that everybody knows what this committee's for. Especially, like, say, we've got a fairly young board as far as there aren't a lot of people who've been on it a really long time, and we're going to lose Dawn, who's going to be is probably the most senior person on the board, and so you have have myself, Gino Grimaldi, who's used to be the city manager of Springfield. He's got a lot of experience, but he might not know what this committee does at all. So I think might be a good idea, and I might suggest this to Caitlin and see if we can have a discussion of what this body does. Now to go into my personal view, I think Aaliyah had a very good point in that there are a lot of downloads that happen which may or may not be really useful. And I think this committee, really should, and this is my opinion, and I don't want to be like the board member saying you thou shalt, but if it was me making this decision, I would be like, we need to focus on XYZ that is very high level strategic. So the last year when we were doing the strategic business plan, and that was the primary focus of what we were doing in this committee. I thought that was really the right use of this committee. As we have these major decisions that are going to come up when we already talked about that list. I want to be able to hear from people who are not me, not necessarily the board, because we get in our, even the board can get a little bit of in a bubble, and you guys, I love hearing from my constituents. I love hearing from you guys. I want to know more about what the community has to say about things, and I think the real challenge is how does this committee communicate to the board what it's really trying to do, and that's partly my job and Susan's as board members on this committee, is to communicate that. So, like, for example, when we made a decision on moving ahead, I made the report that we had a robust discussion and had made decisions that were aligned with what was the staff recommendations, and that helped move that forward. So you know, I think this committee has a purpose. I think we need to have focus, and I think we need to make sure the board knows who this committee is and has a better a clear understanding of what we're doing, and that's partly my job. So that's, sorry, long-winded, but I wanted to say a few things.
No, that's real helpful, P. With respect to the elected members of the committee, I want to look at this in terms of, because it's valuable to have the insights, but I'm not sure. So there's a way to invite them to the table that they don't have to be committee members. They can be, well, the term that we use is ex officio. They're not part of the group, but because of their office, they're here to either engage or, get information. So we could think about that role. What that means in my mind, and why I'm kind of interested in maybe approaching it that way, is that that might open up a few more spots to get some more diversity on the committee as well. So think about it from that standpoint too, as we move forward with that particular element. But yeah, I'm hearing some good things there. So Marianne.
Yeah, I just echo what Pete said about having a purpose, having a focus, and without those things, I think I would agree with Amy that if we don't have those things in place, then this committee really doesn't need to be meeting. And I guess I'm thinking, yeah, just to echo what others have said about having a narrower focus, fewer things to discuss, and really be able to get into those. So I'm remembering a meeting a few years ago about transit tomorrow, and we got together in a room and there was lots of table talk and Post-its and moving things around, and it was a really robust and really productive conversation. But the flip side of that was like, we felt like, yes, we've solved it. People agree, and we want 80% of this and 20% of that, and then it didn't get implemented. And so that's kind of a corollary to that if it's helpful for members to see where our conversations go in the real world. So it's good to have the conversation, but it's better to say, hey, transit tomorrow got implemented, and that's because I was there and had this whole thing to do. So to have longevity on the committee, I think it's important for people to see that their time goes somewhere. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you. That's good. Either Alma or Marty, I don't know.
I'll be really quick.
Okay.
Marty. I just want to echo. So one of the things I heard is this committee started as a opportunity for citizen involvement and citizen voice. And then we're also talking about strategy, right? So there's kind of 2 opposing forces with this. We have a strategic group, and that is our board. The board is supposed to be strategic. And so I agree, keeping things focused and narrow, and really defining what the intention is. So if it is citizen, our citizen involvement, we're hearing from the community, recognizing that that's a little bit different than that. We want to stay strategic, and we want to do that. We have to really create those guardrails and make that space that's gonna help move things forward. And again, with Marianne's point too, it is disheartening as a volunteer to come and get involved, and then for that work not to move forward. So it is nice when we can see things like the strategic business plan that we help participate in and engage. And again, maybe that's a part of this, is being very deliberate about the role that we're playing. And, maybe we're requirement for some of the, listening, paying attention to what's going on with the board reports and the board work too. So I just want to kind of figure out how that looks and how that can fit in. And one of the other things as we're talking about how the history of Mr. Bennett wanting elected officials to be involved because they make decisions. Again, community members, there's folks that are the folks that are utilizing the services, really being intentional about making sure those folks, if we're looking at community involvement, there's got to be that balance between the strategic work that we need and then the community involvement. And what was shared about getting that voice at the table. Sometimes we might be getting in the weeds in different places, but that might be the intent of a specific project. So I think coming back, as Leah had mentioned, the strategic plan and looking at what point do we need that citizen voice, or what the role of this committee can play in that. And also, this is an opportunity for LTD to bring more folks to the table and get them involved in a different way, to me, as a pathway to the board. And if you want to diversify the board and diversify the community, there needs to be a low barrier opportunity for folks to get involved and be engaged in the work. So, and my alarm's going off, so I'm trying to be a good facilitator at 6:50. Not that I'm trying to get that 9 minutes back, but I just want to be really thoughtful about folks' time. So my alarm's telling me that. So I'm going to stop, give it back to Marty, but just making sure we're being thoughtful about the pipelines to leadership opportunities and voice from our community, especially our marginalized community, who are more heavy users in some cases of our services.
Yeah, really good. Thank you.
I'm just going to throw this out really quick, and this is just me touching back to my prior military time, especially when it comes to this type of work. When mission gets to be a little cloudy, structure tends to go that direction as well. But I just remember my time as a security police guy, we used to go out in the field quite a bit, more time than I would have liked. And while we were out in the field, we'd also have times where we would have we would rotate through a certain number of us, usually 5 at a time, would end up going on recon. And even on recon, we have somebody that would be on point. Why I bring this up is that's kind of my vision of this committee. This is sort of a recon committee, and then each person has a role. And I think without having some things clearly defined, it kind of makes the committee kind of convoluted as far as the direction it goes. Does that make sense? Because for me, I think that's been a disconnect since I've been here. It's like, so what exactly is the mission? I think that's what the board's trying to figure. That's like the generals, all you guys back there in the tent, tell us what to do. So we're out here taking on the recon. We got that special op. We're going out here trying to get out here in the trees and whatnot, looking for any possible landmines that you guys weren't thinking about when you're back in the tent. So I think by keeping things a little more clearly defined, that keeps things from getting cloudy as far as that directional point. I mean, I tell people I hate to draw back on military experience, but I like drawing back on military experience because it keeps it really structured in my ADD brain.
Great, thank you.
You bet.
Mike?
I'd just like to commend Amy and Leah, because I think their leadership was some of the best experiences for this committee. We did some of our best work under their leadership. Yeah. We really genuinely did focus on providing advice. The other thing I wanted to mention is that from my perspective, I think Rob Bennett had a good point in trying to get those elected leaders included with us. And there have been times when we've had to sort of remind the elected leaders or their agencies that they are a part of this group, and kind of bring them back in. And it hasn't been that long ago that Sherry Moore, as a city councilor, actually chaired the group. So I'd be reluctant to cut that loose too quickly. I'd rather try and go back and make it work before we decide it isn't going to work. And then finally, I think there's something to be said for the fact that the board, as Pete said, is fairly new as board members for the most part, and probably doesn't have much of a way of knowing that, for example, the board members that are on this committee, their intended role was not so much to provide input to the committee, but to listen intently to the committee and provide that input back to the full board. So I don't know how new board members would ever get to know that, but without that being directly said to them, I can see where it might be confusing to them. What are these other strategic people doing over here when we are the board and we do the strategy for the agency? So that's all I wanted to mention.
Thanks. Well, thank you very much for this. And again, what I'd like to do next time is come back with a more structured list of some of the things that and again, in the context of what we've been talking about, in terms of focusing on, what are those 2 or 3 priorities? Maybe there's one more, I don't, more than 3, but it's in the context of that strategic, and we have a strategic bundle of things that we do. And I think we can come back with what we think that might look like, and maybe you can add and subtract from that, and we can kind of have that as a starting point. I do think, Pete, we want to engage the board in some fashion. Maybe not yet. Maybe we need one more conversation here, but to really, I think there are some things that are missing just in our process when new board members come on. What is this thing called SPC, and how should it work? And ideally, from my standpoint, all the board members are really clear on what this committee is about and what they're working on. And I would agree with those that have indicated maybe that's not quite the case at this point. So,
well, and Tom, just briefly, that the same goes for us too, right? When we have new members on this group, orienting them to our purpose and how we work with the board and some of that history. And
yeah.
I don't know if that's always happened consistently, but
right.
Yeah, both ways.
And Mark has his hand up.
I do. First, there's just a couple of things. One is I really appreciate the discussion, because we need to get value from every committee that we have, but also you need to get value out of it. So you need, we need to connect those dots, say, okay, what's our purpose? And, are we fulfilling that purpose for the agency and for the community? And I think over this transition time, that's maybe gotten lost, and that's why we're having this discussion. So I really appreciate your honesty. I think we do need to Mike's point, reach out to our electeds and say, look, we really need to make sure that we have your input on this stuff, because, you need to know what's going on here, and we need to, understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. And so I do appreciate the discussion, and I look forward to hearing more and doing our part to make sure that we can pull things together and make sure this is a strong, valuable committee for everyone. So thank you.
Real quick, is it the chair's responsibility to reach out to those elected officials and make sure they're coming to the meeting, or?
No,
we can do that.
That's on us.
Yeah, clarifying our roles besides facilitating.
Well, unless you really want to.
Thank you, Tom, for facilitating this conversation. And I want to be cognizant of time. Is there anything else for the good of the order for this particular discussion? Okay. Thank you all. Thank you all for that time. No other actions or information right now for future meeting. And so if there's nothing else, go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, just real quick. I just wanted to let you guys know that what I believe Councilor Evans is in their budget committee meeting tonight. So that's probably why he's not here.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Well, if there's nothing else for the good of the order, appreciate everyone's time, and we will adjourn at 6:58. And I do want to recognize that Amy had come into the meeting too. Sorry, Amy came into the meeting as well today. So thank you all for your time.